What a field day for the heat down there. 1,000 people in the street singing songs and they carrying signs, mostly saying hooray for our side. These battle lines being drawn, nobody's right if everybody wrong. When people speak in their mind, getting so much resistance from behind. We got to stop the children, what's that sound? Everybody look, it's going down.
I am here with one of my favorite media personalities, Krystal Ball, and I was so thrilled to actually find that the event that she's going to tonight was sold out, because if it weren't sold out, I would have gone to it, and I never would have been able to host this thing here tonight. So it worked out, and I want to thank Krystal, and she just wrote a book with Saager Enjeti, who is her co-host on Rising on Hill TV. If you don't watch this show, you must watch this show. You can watch it on YouTube. And her book is called The Populist Guide to 2020, The New Right and the New Left Rising. And basically what it is, it's a compilation of a lot of their commentaries. Krystal is, I like to call her a Bernie supporting journalist. And she is probably the most prominent journalist or a media personality supporting Bernie. I would say we all love Kyle Kulinski and Mike Figueredo and all these people that have great YouTube shows. But this woman was actually on MSNBC. Not that we like MSNBC, and Krystal has a lot to say about it, but before we talk about the book, I'm going to try to find out a little bit about Krystal and her background. So, Krystal, first of all, tell us, you have your email signature that says, yes, this is my real name. What were your parents thinking when they named you Krystal Ball?
Great opening question. Lauren, thank you so much for hosting this event. And I have to say, it makes it's so heartening to be in the room with all of you guys. I know many of you have said what the show has meant to you and the commentary has meant to you. And I have to say that you all mean just as much to us. And I say that incredibly genuinely, because I felt the same way you guys did. It was like, no, am I crazy? Like no one thinks like me, right? And so when we started putting the show up on YouTube and you all found it and you loved it and you commented and you shared it with your friends, I was like, oh, I found my people. So it's meant every bit as much to me as some of you have expressed that means to you. So thank you. All right, so let's talk about the name. First of all, yes, it is my real name. My parents really did do that to me. And they're not even hippies or anything. And they weren't hippies. Probably their biggest rebellion in life was naming me Krystal Ball, to be honest with you. So I have two older sisters. Is it working? Okay. So I have two older sisters. They have normal names. They're Holly and Heidi. I came along. Everybody thought I'd be Heather. It was the 80s after all. But my mom decided, rather than she had named my two older sisters, she decided to let my dad name me. And so they're two, what were they really thinking? I couldn't really tell you because I was not really aware of what they were thinking at the time. But here's the story. Number one, an aunt of mine and my parents had been having a conversation when my mom was pregnant, joking about funny names to put with ball, right? Basket, base, butter, etc. And my aunt suggested Krystal, and it could have been butter, right? It could have been worse. My aunt suggested Krystal, and everybody laughed. But then my dad was sort of like, I kind of like that. And then the other piece is, so he's a physicist, and he did his PhD dissertation on crystals. So it had a meaning to him. So he suggested Krystal. My mom said it has to be with a K, and my middle name is also my mom's choice. It's Marie. And there you go, Krystal Ball. I think they wanted me to have a sense of humor in life. So there you go.
What was your life like growing up that caused you to be concerned about the world, to be a social justice warrior? And I hope you don't mind if I use that term, because I really do think you are. What were some of the influences in your life that made you what you are today?
I grew up in a little town that I actually still live in. It's King George County, Virginia. Jay knows where that's at. He was living just up the road in Stafford. And it's probably, I mean, the town itself, now that I think about it, this didn't occur to me growing up. The whole thing is centered economically around naval research base. That's why my dad, the scientist, worked there. So it's basically like a sort of socialist town because everybody works on the base and draws a government salary. And everyone's more or less middle class. So, you know, there are exceptions. I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but that was generally my experience growing up. And then when I met, actually, my husband, Jonathan, who's right there, was working with a client who was based outside of Pittsburgh. And so we ended up moving to this town called East Liverpool, Ohio, which is right on the border of Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia, where those three states come together. And it was the first place that I had ever lived that had just been destroyed. And, you know, it used to be, once upon a time, it was the pottery capital of the world. So all your plates and dishes and everything were made there. Well, that went overseas in the 50s. Then in the town next door in Beaver, Pennsylvania, there was a steel mill. 10,000, 15,000 good union jobs. You graduate high school, you walk across the street to the steel mill, you're good to go. Family, you know, has a solid middle class income. Well, that, of course, started to go away in the 80s. And so this whole town, which had once been a center of life and community, you know, people would come there for Christmas shopping and for shows and for all sorts of cultural experiences, had just been decimated and as, you know, a center point, flashpoint of the opioid crisis now as well. What really got me, though, was that it wasn't just this one town, right? You go up and down the Ohio River, and it was town after town after town. And I came to realize, too, that, you know, so many politicians, of course, Ohio being a swing state, Pennsylvania being a swing state, both of them right there, all these politicians would traipse through town when it came election time, and they'd promise, we're going to bring it back, and we're going to fight for you, and all this stuff. And all of them, one after another, just sold these people down the river. And so, of course, this is exactly the kind of town that has turned away from their roots, their Democratic Party roots. I mean, over the time that I've known it, it's just gotten redder and redder and redder, and now is represented by some, you know, Tea Party type Republican in the Congress. That was really an awakening for me because I had just never lived in a place like that where the economic destruction of neoliberalism was so tangible and the pain that that brought. And not just in terms of the economic livelihood, which is, you know, sort of the shorthand way of talking about this, but in the way that the pride and the center of that community had just been hollowed out and stripped away. And it's not just in the industrial Midwest. I mean, you all can tell me more about it than I would ever know. But, you know, neoliberalism is a cancer that afflicts all of our communities, even the ones that are doing incredibly well, right? There's plenty of wealthy people here. There's plenty of people doing incredibly well. But the gap between those who are succeeding and those who are being left behind and who are expected to do the serving of the people that are succeeding is not something that is moral. It's not something any of us should tolerate. It's not something that we have to tolerate, right? This is all a choice. So I would pin my sort of initial awakening to that. Another piece was becoming a mom. And I, you know, had my daughter, my oldest, who's 11 now. I had her right in the height of the 2008 primary. Thank you, whoever said that. I really appreciate it. And obviously that changes your perspective, makes you feel like you need to be more participatory, less passive and more active. But there were also little things like I remember trying to buy her a baby bottle and realizing there was this toxic BPA in the bottles. Why? Because some plastics lobby or whoever had paid off our members of Congress so that they were literal toxins in the baby bottles. I mean, that's how corrupt this whole thing is top to bottom. And so those have been my touchstones. And, you know, as all of us have, I think I've tried to learn and evolve over the years. I certainly learned a lot in 2016. It's recommitted me to the movement and I think clarified for me the sort of historical moment that we're living through. But those issues of corruption and inequality and the core rot of neoliberalism that has been wrought upon this country are sort of the touchstones of my political philosophy.
So you were an accountant. That was your first profession. Then you ran for office, and then you worked for MSNBC, or okay, yes. So tell us about that period of your life, how that all happened.
Oh, this is a good story. You guys don't know this story? This is a really good story. All right. So yes, I was an accountant. CPA. I was actually working in government accounting software, which is every bit as exciting as it sounds. And as exciting as it was, I was kind of looking for a change. And so when I met my husband, Jonathan, and we got married, he's an entrepreneur and was working in education. And so we started working together. And I started having the frustrations that I was just discussing, both with the town we're living in and the corruption and the Iraq war fallout, all of that, right? And so he was the one who actually put it to me, like, why don't you run for Congress? That's crazy. Like, I've never even worked on a campaign. What are you talking about? And he worked on me. And finally he's like, look at this schmuck who's representing this district. Like, this guy is so lame. Certainly. And I was like, you know what? He is pretty lame. I could probably do a better job than him. So I had kind of a moment that I think a lot of people had after 2016, a lot of women in particular who stepped in and ran for office or became activists in ways that they never had imagined before. That was me at that time, and I ended up running for Congress in 2010, very red rural district. Great timing, to Tea Party era that it was. Error was actually, that was a better way of saying it. So the transition from that to media, and this is the story that's interesting if you all don't know it. So I was a young woman, 28 years old, with this long hair and this weird name, this baby, and I worked so hard to get people to take me seriously, right? So hard to get people to take this girl with the name Krystal Ball seriously as a potential member of Congress, right? Real struggle. That struggle was real. And so we're getting close to Election Day, and I get a message from Jonathan, and it says, everything's fine, but don't check your email. Call me immediately. I was like, okay, that doesn't sound great. So it turns out someone had leaked these photos of me at a party, which I was of age. I was fully clothed. They were sort of, suggestive. So everybody lost their minds about this thing. And it's so tame by today's standards. You wouldn't even believe how tame it was. But so this became like a major news cycle. Cable news. I mean, the whole thing. I was the second most Googled person in the world. It was insane. And, right? And at the time, I mean, now it's hilarious. At the time, it was devastating because all these people had taken a chance on me, right? And I felt like, even though I had done nothing wrong, I felt like I had let them down, right? And so most of my advisors said, there was two pieces of advice. One group said, just don't say anything. The other group said, say it's not you. And luckily, I got some better advice again from my husband, who said, this is some sexist bullshit, and you need to call it out as such. He's a good guy. Made a good choice there. So I said, you know what? You're right, because whatever happens in this campaign, Lord knows I'm not going to be the last young woman who they try to smear and slut shame and keep from holding office. So I gotta make my stand here. So I did, and that moment when someone tried to destroy me by putting those photos out there is actually what made the media take notice, gave me a platform, and it's how I ended up at MSNBC. So it's funny how these things work out.
What happened in Congress?
I did not become a member of Congress.
Okay.
Not yet, anyway.
You were on MSNBC during the Obama years when I was quickly disillusioned with Obama. I had been, I was disillusioned with Obama. I got involved with Occupy, and then I discovered protest, and I must have organized about 36 protests since Occupy. My big issues were the TPP, net neutrality, fracking, education privatization. Those are still my big issues. We got it, net neutrality, then we lost it. Now we got to get it back again. But in any case, I remember that's when I first met Bernie, actually, in April of 2012. Before I joined Occupy during the Arab Spring, and also Wisconsin, when 100,000 people went to Madison, and instead of going around the country, they got behind that candidate, Tom Barrett. And it was so bad because he lost, and they lost the recall, and 30% of the people who voted against recalling Scott Walker were union members. So they really missed an opportunity to show why unions are so important then. But at that same point in time, I was meeting Bernie Sanders, and I had never watched him on Thom Hartmann. I knew who he was, but I heard him talk, and the first thing I said in the Q&A was, "Will you please challenge Obama in the 2012?" And I'll never forget how he answered, because he said, "No!" "No!" And I knew at that point that he was not ambitious, okay? He did not want to be president. The only reason he ran in 2016 was because Elizabeth Warren did not. You were on during the day, you weren't on in prime time, and that was when I still, I think, like Rachel Maddow. She was actually doing good stuff. Like she was doing the first reporting about the emergency managers in Benton Harbor. And I remember, like, I think I saw you, and eventually I started seeing things that you were saying that were kind of progressive that, weren't like some of the other hosts. But of course, I knew what they had done to Keith Olbermann, Phil Donahue, and actually, I just recently started up with cable again for 2 years because I couldn't stand shouting at my TV. And Rachel Maddow was dead to me. I mean, I cannot look at that woman. I cannot hear her voice. I have a visceral reaction to it. But what can you tell us about your time working at MSNBC and any stories that you might have wanted to do that were thwarted either by your producer or by Phil Griffin, who is head of the network?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. So look, I mean, overall, I have to say, I'm grateful that they gave me the opportunity, the training, and all those things that I had. And I will also say that you were much quicker and smarter to the Obama skepticism than certainly I was. The Republicans were behaving like such assholes at the time, as they still are, that it was easy to just fixate on them and not always see the problems on our own side. And I fully admit I bought into that way too often. However, one of the things that I look back on now as having been incredibly telling is during the fight for TPP, which was, something that I was very strongly against, that I saw such activist energy out there from yourself and I'm sure many other people in this room and many, many more across the country. And again, going back to, my sort of political awakening was a real touchstone for me in terms of the way that these trade deals had just screwed over so many of our communities, hollowing them out. And so this was important to me, and I thought it was important to other people. And so when I would want to cover it on the show, the message I got back was, nobody cares about that. And of course, I mean, it just goes to show you, I think that was genuinely the thought, because if you live in Manhattan, and you're in a certain social circle, nobody that you talk to cares about this. Of course, we all know it ended up being one of the most central issues of 2016, of vital importance, right? And trade in general is something that I think, it's bipartisan concern and something that deeply shapes our lives and our politics. And there was just a complete blind spot there. The other moment that maybe some of you have heard me talk about before, or maybe some of you even saw this monologue, is I could see as it didn't take a rocket scientist to see that Hillary Clinton was a bad candidate for the presidency.
Hello.
I can't say this was any moment of particular brilliance on my part. But, I put together, we did monologues on my show, just like we do the radars now. And so I put together one saying, please don't run. Right? And I begged actually Elizabeth Warren to run. My feelings are a little different. But someone who's giving speeches at Goldman Sachs, who's an emblem of the establishment at a time of soaring inequality where we've had this horrible recession and people have never recovered and the middle class has been decimated. I mean, you could not pick a worse candidate, right? And said with respect, right? Because I did do respect her service to the country and her intellect and those parts of her. And so I did this monologue, and I wasn't censored. I was allowed to say whatever I wanted to say. It was fine. But afterwards, I got a message from the president of the network that the Hillary people had expressed their displeasure. Wait, that's shocking. And I know your son, and with the implication being that basically, if we didn't sort of do a better job towing the line, then they were not going to give us us being MSNBC, access to her and her people, etc. So again, I wasn't told I couldn't say anything.
Sounds so Trump.
But it does sound rather Trumpian. However, I was told that from then on out, anything I was going to say about Hillary Clinton had to be approved by the president of the United States. Which, look, I mean, it's, you know, it's remarkable that, needless to say, that's not a normal state of affairs, that every, you know, every commentary has to be run through the President Network. And look, I'm a human being. I can't say that that didn't affect my willingness to say the things that I wanted to say. Of course, when you're in that environment, you know what should be rewarded for and what should be punished for and what should be scrutinized for and what the blowback will be. It's very hard not to let those things affect you. So it gives you a little bit of a window into the way that this works, right?
Yes.
It's not that there was any sort of grand scheme, but there's this desire to have access, you know where your bread is buttered, you know who your customers are, you know what, from a career perspective, everybody in that building, everybody at Washington Post, New York Times, CNN, etc. They know what sort of behavior and commentary will be rewarded. They know what will be frowned upon. And so that's the subtle way that this is all shaped. Not to mention the class piece of, you know, even, for example, on the cycle. I love all my cycle co-hosts. I'm so close with most of them. But the original 4 co-hosts, I was the only one not from Massachusetts. Like, just to give you a sense of the kind of, you know, like the kind of groupthink that can go on, where even if there's a surface level of diversity, there's very little diversity in terms of class or ideology. And so it becomes very easy to insulate yourself. And then we see the results. I mean, one of the things, and we can pivot a little bit to the book with this, I mean, one of the things that I write about in the book, and one of the reasons we wrote the book, is that the media is still wrong about almost literally everything. Whatever they say is going to happen, you should bet on the opposite. And you would think that after 2016 and the humbling of never taking the Sanders movement seriously, never taking Donald Trump seriously, thinking 100% that Hillary was going to win, all of that, you would think there would have been a little bit of soul searching, but there never was. Instead, they came up with excuses, right? And some of these excuses, I mean, they have a grain of truth, right? Did Comey's last-minute presser affect the election? Probably, right? Sexism. Did that affect the election? Yeah, probably, right? Did Russia affect Facebook ads, right?
Bernie memes. I mean, look, maybe a little, I don't know, around the margins. But these became all-encompassing narratives that were used to explain away the fact that the theory of politics they had been advocating for decades had been exposed as a complete failure. And so the book, Populist Guide to 2020, is all about, look, it's for people like the people in this room who are activists, who get this populist anger that is out there and are part of a movement to respond to that in a productive way that'll be good for the whole country and good for the world. But it's also for people who don't understand that energy, who are still watching Rachel Maddow and are wondering, like, why is none of this making sense to me, right? Why are all these things happening in this election that my favorite pundits didn't predict or see coming? So the book is an effort to try to track that populist energy and think about what it means and where it's ultimately going.
Well, you know, it's interesting that you say that about Rachel Maddow, because one of the things that I'm also an activist about is racial justice, and there's a group called Justice LA that was trying to get rid of cash bail, and they did get rid of cash bail, but at the last minute, they put in some things called predictive policing, which the racial justice groups found almost as bad, and they took their names off of it. But by that point, the train had left the station, and everybody had already patting themselves on the back. And when Tom Steyer said he worked for that, that was Bob Hertzberg's bill. But it's really problematic. So I was live streaming Jane Fonda, who's such a great activist. She just took her Fire Drill Fridays to LA. She was talking about this bill, and she had just been informed that she shouldn't be advocating for it. And she said, you know, and I was watching Rachel Maddow the other day, and I was listening to John Brennan from what was he, CIA, and you know, I couldn't believe that I was actually listening to John Brennan, and I was thinking to myself, no, Jane, you should not be listening to John Brennan, or Malcolm Nance or any of these former spooks that they have on there, and they don't announce that they're actually paid consultants. But here's my thing, and this is what I want to talk about, the media chapter of your book, because I wanted to get into media since the 70s. And when I started in Boston in 1980, they didn't even have cable TV. My first job was in franchising to try to get the company that I was working for to get licenses in the Boston suburbs. And even then, we were starting to have this cross-ownership, this concentration of ownership thing in the 80s. This is the early 80s. And now we're talking, 40 years later, it is so worse. We only have 5 companies that control the media. And back then, I remember, and I was also a student of the media, so I remember that when William Paley, who had Edward R. Murrow, and, CBS was such a venerated news organization, he was running the news division as a loss center. It wasn't a profit center. And it wasn't until Tisch, Larry Tisch, who owned the Lowe's hotel chain, bought CBS and then realized that news could be a profit center. And 60 Minutes was their most profitable program. And I always liked 60 Minutes, but it always made like the one bad apple. It was one bad guy or one bad company. They never investigated the systemic, right? So at that point, these news personalities became just that. They weren't journalists. They were personalities. They were entertainers. As I call them now, stenographers for the corporate state. And they're really just trying to get ratings for their advertisers. And one point that I want to make, and I want to know what you think about it, people didn't understand, why was CNN calling this thing for Buttigieg? Why did Tom Paris, say we're going to have a recount, and then call for a recount, which, by the way, he cannot order. That's the Iowa Democratic Party can do that, and they will only do it if one of the candidates asks for it. And then they said this right before he was to go on the stage, when AP didn't call it, Reuters didn't call it, the New York Times didn't call it. So I tweeted out, maybe it's because, and this was this article that I found, that the headline was, Bernie Sanders single-handedly fights the AT&T Time Warner merger. And this was 2 years ago. And it was also, Bernie Sanders was celebrating the fact that CNN had to pay a $76 million payment for back pay. It was the National Labor Relations Board biggest award they ever gave in back pay to CNN employees. So I was wondering if I know we're skipping ahead, and there was stuff I wanted to talk to you more about, how you started Rising and Saager, and how you, prepare for your shows. I want to get back to that, but since we started on the media, what is your opinion about the way the different networks have handled this thing in Iowa?
I mean, it's funny, CNN is starting to have me on, which is amusing. But this is what I actually said to them on their own air, is how can you fixate on these delegates when the state delegate equivalents, when your own reporting says they're wrong, right? Your own reporting. So, I mean, look, with all of these things, follow the money, right? Follow the money. So how do journalists, political journalists, and anchors and all these people? Well, in part, it's from a culture of access, right? They have all their sources and all their relationships within the establishment that are part of how they make their money and how they succeed in their enterprise. You have excuse me, at the corporate level, you have the incentive of, look, they're playing, as a capitalist organization, they're playing to their consumers. Yes. Their consumers are not working class people. Their consumers are affluent, mostly white liberals. Right? Yes. So that's the framing. That's the framing of the New York Times. That's the Washington Post. They are playing to their audience. And so if you have that in your mind when you're watching all the coverage, you go, oh, that's why they say Amy Klobuchar won every debate, right? Like, oh, that's why. Okay, I got it. Which is, I mean, hilarious, right? Hilarious, but also not funny at all. And it's the same thing, though. You ask yourself, why does the Democratic establishment hate Bernie so much? Like, where does it come from? And it, again, fear and follow the money, because, look, they've got think about this shadow app and acronym and all that, right? This is a tremendous
grift, basically, of the Democratic consultant class.
They know that if Sanders is in office, he's not going to take their cars.
That's right.
He's not going to pat their egos. None of that. They're not going to be invited to the White House Christmas party.
That's right, yeah. We are.
We are, yeah.
We are. That's right, because when we're in the White House. That's right.
Wow. So, I mean, so that is why it's not really so much about his. Look, most of these people are not particularly ideological. They're working for John Delaney this cycle and for Elizabeth Warren next cycle. You know, it's more about. So it's not even really an ideological adversity, except in the ways that he threatens the corporate interests that they also, you know, sit on the boards of or get their donations from, etc. But it's about that access and that deal flow and that center of power being taken away from them. That's why he is an existential threat to the Democratic Party, and why they rightfully fear that.
More so than Trump.
Well, you know, as a history major and as someone who studied the history of journalism, I think it all changed when it became a profession. Because it used to be these scrappy reporters, they would have the City Hall beat, they would try to speak truth to power, and then they had journalism school, and it's expensive. And you have a line in your book that you say, news isn't judged just on its newsworthiness, it's filtered through a prism of elite solidarity and class solidarity and institutional self-preservation. And I think that's because, and we used to talk about, you know, how these journalists in D.C., they went to the same schools as the people they were covering. They sent their kids to the same private schools, Georgetown Country Day or Sidwell Friends, that the politicians were sending their kids to. They just have so far removed from the kind of growing up that you were talking about. And it's true, I mean, I had a very upper middle class background, and it wasn't until Occupy that I started socializing with a different class of people. I mean, it took me till I was in my 50s. And as liberal or progressive, I hate the word liberal, but as progressive as I've always been, it really was an epiphany for me. And I don't think, and I have friends, well, my old friends, I'm not friends with them anymore. And I know they have the biggest hearts, you know, they're very charitable, they're very concerned about all this stuff, but they just don't know anyone personally. They don't know part of the 50% of Americans that don't have $400 in the bank to take care of an emergency, that have to choose between you know, their medication and food. Or students, so many of them are homeless, that have to choose between paying rent and buying books. I mean, these people, these reporters, and you know, when I was at Bernie's fundraiser, that was not a high dollar fundraiser, up in San Francisco at the California Democratic Party in May, there was Shane Goldmacher and the other one, Sean Sullivan, in the press area talking to each other about baseball. So instead of moving around the room and asking all these people, why are you here, why do you support Bernie Sanders, they were talking to each other. And I sort of interrupted. Of course. And I said, you know, I wanted to talk to you about, you know, this coverage that Sydney Ember has been doing in the New York Times, you know, because she hates Bernie and she's so negative to Bernie. And Shane Goldmacher could not have been more dismissive. He said, well, you know, we post, you know, because she said, about Daniel Ortega, remember that? She actually tried to make a big thing like he was supporting this, you know, socialist, you know, dictator or whatever she wanted to present that he was. Did you realize back then that, you know, and he was like, well, maybe you don't know. I mean, he tried to be polite to her, but she clearly did not know. And this Sydney Ember is a person that, you know, she grew up here. Her mom, actually, I met her at an alumni function. She went to Wesleyan, as I did. And Katie Halper is a Wesleyan alum. And so some of us turned out okay. and so Sydney Ember, she went to Harvard Westlake, which is like now it's probably $50,000 a year. You know, she went to Brown, I think. And then she was like a reporter for Bloomberg, or she was like a business reporter, and she's married to some investment banker. And so I just know this woman. I mean, I could be this woman. She just doesn't know these people. And I don't know that she has I mean, what is your take? Because you know a lot of these people.
there's a deep amount of classism in this country. I mean,
Yes.
it's endemic. So people have contempt for the working class just as a matter of course. I mean, it's part of the way that, frankly, Donald Trump's movement was also completely dismissed and not viewed. And, you know, I don't want to compare the two, but that is why they didn't see him coming. So, yeah, I mean, the Walmart workers and the Amazon workers and the Starbucks workers and the teachers who are disproportionately funding Bernie Sanders' campaign and passionate for him, knocking doors for making votes, they don't know any of these people, right? Not really. Maybe they've interacted with them at a cash register while they were getting their coffee or whatever, but they don't know these people. And so it becomes very easy to feel like Hillary Clinton, right? Nobody likes him. To me, that comment was so revealing for exactly what you're saying, Lauren, which is that in Hillary's world, yeah, nobody likes him, right?
Exactly.
She's traveling in these elite circles up in, you know, her fancy enclave in New York. Nobody likes him there. And so when that's what you're surrounded with, it does become very easy to think this isn't a real phenomenon. Yeah, there's some kids like at his rally or whatever. Who cares about them? And you still see it, right? Even after he wins Iowa. I mean, think about this. A Democratic Socialist just won Iowa. He won it by mobilizing young people, yes, but immigrant communities and black and brown working class people who literally came to caucus before having to go work their shift at the pork processing plant. I mean, if those aren't the people we want in the party, I don't know who is.
Exactly.
And so they erase all of that and dismiss it. Oh, well, it's just Iowa and it's mostly white anyway, so we'll just not pay any attention to that. But it all comes from that place of you're exactly right, because they don't have it and see it in their life and see it in their circles. No one that they interact with likes Bernie. Therefore, nobody likes Bernie.
And your book was organized into 4 sections. The first one was core rot, was it? And then media. No, wait. The second part was
core rot, and then it was. Then I think it was media, and then identity, and then theories of change.
Right. So let's talk about identity, because that's sort of what we're leading into here, is woke. And this is where you and Saager kind of agree on this. And I feel like the left and the right weaponize identity, okay? And I have an issue with identity politics on the left, because I'll give you an example. I remember there was a young man who worked for Bernie Sanders in 2016, and he was from Black Lives Matter. And after Obama, left office and he started to make $400,000 a speech, he was posting about how this is great, let the brother, make his money. And I'm like, what? You supported Bernie Sanders? I mean, that's kind of disgusting. I mean, here's this guy who did not prosecute any of these banksters. He bailed out Wall Street and sold out, homeowners. Yep. And you think it's okay for him to make $400,000? And he says, well, white girl, why are you? No, seriously. I mean, I can't tell you how many people have told me, Lauren, you don't know how to talk to black people because I say these things. And he says, have you said that to anybody else? And I'm like, yeah, I would say that to, Jamie Dimon. I would say that to, Lloyd Blankfein. I would say that to any of these people. It's not just Obama. I mean, and so I then learned about this term, the oppression Olympics. And that's kind of like where, you'll hear from African Americans that some of them, not all, will say, well, I can't talk to you until we deal with the original sin, which is slavery. And then you'll talk to Native Americans, and they'll say, I can't talk to you until we deal with the original sin, which is the genocide of our people. Right. And then Latinos will have a different thing that they're concerned about. And the problem is, they're pitting all these different identity groups, women too, and I'm into this thing right now. I'm doing a deep dive into the divide between radical feminists and trans people, okay? Radical second-wave feminists. And the problem is that we're so busy fighting each other, that we're not uniting as the 99%, which is why the Occupy movement and the Bernie Sanders movement were so important to me. Because we, and like Bernie always says, we're 99%, we're more than them. And yet we're infighting.
Yeah.
So what would you like to share, especially, from your book and about this identity politics thing?
First of all, the one issue I would take with the way that you characterize that is I don't actually think it is mostly the, Native people or African Americans who are pushing this. It's mostly white people. It's mostly who are pushing this. And look, I think everybody in this room agrees. Racism, sexism, like bigotry is real, right? And these are important structural issues that we need to take seriously and deal with. I mean, everybody's on the same page there. But when you think about, so I part of what I talk about in the book is view the lens of identity through like the Kamala Harris candidacy, right?
Exactly.
Where what the pundits told us going in was that Kamala Harris was going to be the top contender, right? The top contender. Why? Because of her identity. Right? Because she has a trailblazing identity and she's got this resume, and so surely there's going to be a massive wave of support for her, in particular among the African American community, because because she's black people must be ready to go sign up for it.
No way.
But then when it turns out, that she doesn't stand for anything, she pretended to support Medicare for all when it served her. The moment I'm sure she got some donor pushback or whatever, she runs right away from that. She changes her slogan every season. She ends up just running on this sort of, generic neoliberal stuff. And so it doesn't appeal to black people. It doesn't really appeal to much of anyone, right?
That's Tulsi called her out on facts.
Yeah.
Tulsi did call her out, for sure.
And her prosecution record.
And so that's the prosecution record is really important, and that's one of the things that I say in the book. Like, if you are a young single mother, a young single black mother, does it really matter to you that it's a trailblazing black woman who's prosecuting you for your kids being truants? Right? Does that really make it better?
And then you going to jail for that?
Right. Or if you're a homeowner, if you're a middle-class black homeowner who got screwed in the financial crisis and lost your house, like, does it really make you feel better that it was the nation's first black president who did nothing to help you?
Kamala should not prosecute Steve Mnuchin.
Steve Mnuchin donated
for fraud, and he donated to he donated to her attorney general campaign, and then when she didn't prosecute him, he donated to her Senate campaign because she was extremely ambitious. And I got dragged on Twitter, I have to say, because when Willie Brown came out with his article, where he said he helped her in her career, I said, well, it's a sign of her naked ambition, and that's a term I said naked ambition. Obviously, she didn't go out with a man 31 years older for love or sexual attraction. I could not go on Twitter for 5 days. I mean, you're climbing that whole of that tweet. I mean, even Bernie Sanders could go. Said, because there's some Bernie, I had Bernie, you know how you can change your Twitter name, and I had something about Bernie that time, instead of the robust, I was the worst time to put Bernie in my Twitter. Everybody was like, oh, and even Joan Walsh, she got some sort of article about this, and they were saying that it was misogynist and racist. There was even a term I learned, misogynoir. Misogynoir.
You learned what it was.
Right, because Kamala was, like you said, there was no core ideology. I know a guy who ran for Senate. Some of you may know him. I'm not going to say his name here, but he was an attorney, and he has friends who worked in the Attorney General's office, and he said no sooner did she get elected to that office than she was already running for Senate. Yes. So she's extremely ambitious. That's her core ideology. Yeah. That and her record, her prosecutorial record is what did her in. And thank God for African American publications like The Root and like Black Agenda Report, because when the K-Hive went after you on Twitter, and they were calling me the white woman, I was saying, well, what do you think of what Michelle Alexander said? Or what do you think of what Michael Harriot said? Or, any other African American person?
Yeah. No, and that's it. And so that's the part of it that I really object to is oftentimes, and look, Tulsi Gabbard is a perfect example, right? She's a woman of color. Yes. They don't love her, do they? Because she's not convenient for their ideology. She challenges the status quo. And so identity is often used to create an illusion of progress and change in the service of status quo politics, right? We're gonna have, right, we're gonna Pete. Think about Pete,
gay.
right? We're gonna have the same old neoliberal disaster that we've had for decades, but we have a gay man, and so that is supposed to count as progress. Look, if my only choice is to have a more diverse oligarchy, fine. Changing the gender ratio of our oppressors.
Steve Bannon said, I want them to talk about racism every day. Wait, I'm calling up this article from the New York Times from 2017. The longer they talk about identity politics, I got them, he said of the Democrats. I want them to talk about racism every day. If the left is focused on race and identity and we go with economic nationalism, we can crush the Democrats. Now, some of you might have seen Steve Bannon was on Bill Maher. And I don't watch Bill Maher anymore because he annoys me about as much as Rachel Maddow. I could not believe when I was in Occupy LA, he was walking around, you know, trying to talk to people. Nobody really wanted to talk to him. And then when he gave Obama in 2012 $1 million for his re-election, after Obama showed what a neoliberal he was, I just thought, oh my God, that really is what Bill Maher is all about. And I just can't watch it. I don't like snark anyway. But
Hold on.
I don't like it.
I agree. I'm with the snark. I'm on team snark.
But it's when you take snark and superiority and you put it together. He's so self-righteous and superior. And so he had Steve Bannon on last night, and everybody's been tweeting about this today because Steve Bannon was talking about, did you see it? Did you see the clip?
Yeah.
And Holly Otterbein, speaking about, you know, Politico. So Holly Otterbein is the reporter from Politico who they assigned to cover Bernie Sanders.
Yeah.
So she tweets out this segment basically saying, and this is her opinion, this is not a news article, this is her tweet, that there Steve Bannon is, this is what the Trump people are doing, Trump aides are trying to get people to vote for Bernie Sanders and vote for Trump. This was her opinion as opposed to actually listening to what he had to say. And Bill Maher, to his credit, agreed with him about the fact that, you know, they're both populists, they're both appealing to this, you know, population that you're talking about. And, you know, Holly Otterbein, I looked her up. I looked up Abby Phillips, too. I looked up Greg Brundage. I'm kind of curious as to the background of these journalists that say these things about Bernie. And she started out on the City paper in Philadelphia. And she actually has, you know, tens of thousands of dollars of student debt. When she was writing for the City paper, she was writing some really important articles. And now that she's in Politico, she's been totally, you know, co-opted by the party line. And Politico is owned by Joseph Albritton, who sold his TV stations to Sinclair TV.
Wow.
And if you think Fox is bad, Sinclair is even worse. They actually tell their reporters what to say on the air. They are totally Trump TV.
Yeah.
So here's this guy who also went to Wesleyan, endowed a building, an entire center on media at Wesleyan, and he sells these TV stations, not caring at all about what the effect would be on the country. Similarly to when Bill Clinton, with his Telecommunications Act of 1998, deregulated the media, which enabled Clear Channel to buy 1,000 radio stations and put Rush Limbaugh on all of them. So when you're driving through the South, as I sometimes do, that's all you hear, that and religious TV. And it's been so horrible for the nation. But you know, who was it that said, it's good, maybe, who was the media head that said,
Les Moonves.
Yes,
CBS is good.
It may be
Trump
bad
is good
for the
business.
country, but it's good for business.
So, hey, listen, you got to admire his honesty, right? There you go.
Team snark.
That is the truth, though. That is what it comes down to. It shouldn't be viewed as, look, it's infotainment. It's not news. It's not journalism. And the thing is,
But people think it's news.
and they do, and it's incredibly damaging. I mean, the country would be better off if these channels just did not exist.
Right.
So
Thank you.
Look, I'm very upfront, as you all know, on Rising. Saager's very upfront about the lens that we view politics through, right? We tell you what it is. So you know what our biases are, right? You know how we're looking at these things.
Right.
What I find really distressing is when you have people who pretend to be, I'm just a down the middle, straight news reporter, I'm just neutral and I'm neutral.
No.
I mean, these are some of the most ideological people that are out there, right? Where you can do a fact check of Bernie Sanders where you find, oh, he accurately cited academic research and still give him 3 Pinocchios. I mean, that's things that literally happen, right? Or, you know, they ignore the polls where he's doing well, or they'll write the headline about, you know, Pete Buttigieg in 4th, but a strong 4th, right? I mean, and so they are very ideological, and that is, to me, what is very distressing, is when they pretend to be neutral and people believe they're really just straight-up journalists calling balls and strikes, but really they are anything but. And I know Politico is one of the most ideological outlets out there. And I know, you know, Holly and all of them are under tremendous pressure to report the news in a certain approved way. So I want to make sure we get everybody books though.
Okay, we have to wrap up because we're almost at the end, and Krystal has another event tonight. But can I just ask you one final question about the show? I'm curious as to how you found Saager. And you know, how you come up with topics for the show. Do you write everything yourself that you say?
So the monologues are all us. So the radars, he writes his, I write mine, we come up with the elements, those are 100% us. And, you know, I mean, we definitely drive a lot of the creative process, obviously in collaboration with our producers and bookers, so it really is very much a joint effort. So Saager was I just got lucky with Saager, right? So I actually originally had a different co-host of the show. His name was Buck. He was fine. I like him. He's a good guy. He has a more standard issue Republicanism, you know, sort of Reagan-era type standard issue Republican. We got on great, but the politics weren't quite as interesting. And Buck wanted to move on. He's got a radio show that he wanted to focus in on, so he was going to leave. And Saager had filled in for him a couple times, and I really liked Saager. I mean, you guys are right? So, and look, Saager is a lot younger than me, and he hasn't done. You know, I had all the time at MSNBC and everything, but this guy, the moment he jumped in the anchor chair, was like, you know, you're gonna pick this up like it's nothing, and of course he has, and is an incredible partner to work with. I mean, really, just is the greatest guy you can imagine working with. So we just really got lucky with him.
Well, I just want to thank everybody. There's so much more I can ask Krystal, and hopefully you can come on my show.
I would love that.
Continue to talk about the election, because I mean, I had a bunch of questions about the debate last night and where you think Bernie's going to end up beyond this. But right now we need to end, and I want to just promote this book. If you can get a close up, it's called The Populist Guide to 2020: A New Right and a New Left Are Rising, by Krystal Ball and Saager Enjeti. So thank you so much.
Krystal Ball! Krystal Ball! Krystal Ball! Krystal Ball!